Well, good evening, and we are a couple minutes away from starting tonight's talk. This is a series of talks called the Cruciform Way, where we're discussing leadership and humility, encouraging, inviting, and asking for feedback and input. I've had a couple of great emails from people this week sharing their experiences both with the content here as well as the Bible studies, and it's wonderful, it's helpful, so thank you for that. If you are not watching live, I still want to encourage you to type in comments or send them by email. I mean, there's two main ways for you to watch this. One is you're on Facebook Live, and if you're there, you subscribe to the Westside Church Richland page, and then with this, I think there's a way of saying that you're interested in this event, and then it'll give you the little reminders. But pretty much every Thursday from 6:30 to 7:30. The other way that you could be watching this is through the church's website. Now, right now, with the church's website, you're really just going to be able to watch it via recording. And so it gets posted fairly quickly after it goes live. And then it has its own page. And one of the nice things about the website, I think, is that it's easier to go to and really watch the back episodes, the back discussions, where you can go back and you can say, okay, I've missed some and I want to go back, and they're all in order, and that makes it easy. We are, starting last week, we entered into a new section, or maybe it's been 2 weeks, but where we're now beginning to focus our attention on some of the literature and having some discussions on both leadership and humility. And we began with the question, do humility and leadership really go together? And one of the things that as you examine leadership literature, it's not altogether clear, at least not to everybody. But since the advent of Jim Collins and Good to Great, there is a growing consensus of an appreciation and recognition that humility is important, and in fact, humility and leadership do go together. Now, we had that discussion, and there's some interesting observations to make in the midst of it, as far as why doesn't everybody see it, and some of those things really are raising questions which we are going to address over the next few weeks as we are looking broadly. One of the other things in this time, as in this section of things, is I'm going to be mentioning a lot of different books. And if you're a reader, and I will ultimately put together a list of books, and I'll kind of clarify as far as kind of topic and an area where this might be a place for you, that if you want to dig more deeply in this specific area, that you could then pick up one of these books. And that's in part what a literature review does, is different, you're working on this, and I spent hundreds of hours reading, and so I become a quick resource and an easy resource of kind of giving you an overview, a discussion of a number of different books that are related to this, and which are the ones that would seem to be the most germane, the most appropriate, the most focused in my area. So one of my encouragements is this, is I'm going to try to bring to the surface and have discussion this concept of leadership and humility. Do they really go together? Yes, they do. It's a growing consensus. Not everybody sees it. Why is that happening? Well, one of the issues has to do with our understanding of leadership. And so where we are and what we've been discussing is just the reality of this huge industry that now exists on leadership, where there are every year hundreds of books written on leadership. And so And so there's a little bit here of discernment. Which are the ones? What are they about? And what am I going to read because I only have so much time? And as we begin to try to wade into this leadership literature, we're going in with this focus of leadership and humility. And we're starting with just kind of, well, what exactly is leadership? I mean, there's all these leadership books. And in our discussion last week, what you find in the literature itself is it's hard to define, but at the very same time, good leadership is something that typically people, when they see it, they know it. And some of the affirmations from this is that from Max Dupree, leadership is more of an art. It's more tribal. It's something that you can't just fix it all down into these simple things, but it's also something that you grow into. And pretty much most everybody agrees leaders are more made than born. And somebody like a Bill Robinson would sit there and say, we all know that nature and nurture are some sort of a dynamic, and people have personality traits. And what we're learning and affirming is that there's not one type of leader, but there are certain qualities, certain characteristics that end up forming a good leader. And part of my argument is that humility is actually one of the most essential character traits for leaders. Jim Collins would agree with me, and more importantly, so would Jesus. And so we that's where we were from up to our last discussion is this conversation about some of the different literature out there, some of the different books, how they approach defining leadership. I'll introduce another book to you. It's by Todd Bolsinger, Canoeing Through the Mountains. Now this book is in particular focused on church leadership and helping the church, the whole church, understand the time that we find ourselves in and the type of leadership that will be most helpful of getting us through these times. And his analogy is something that probably many of us, because we're, if you're watching this, my assumption is you're probably here in the Tri-Cities. If not, let me know. Love to know if there's other people out there. But he focuses in on the story of Lewis and Clark. And when they started this journey, they were charged with the mission of finding the Northwest Passage and finding a waterway that connected the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the working assumption is that there was a waterway that you could navigate that would take you from one side of the country to the other. And if that's your working assumption and you're just really quite sure of it, well, you're probably at that point of time, you're going to recruit the very best river navigators that you can. And that's what they did. And they were moving themselves up the great Mississippi, and then they continued to go, and then they finally reached the Rocky Mountains. And then suddenly they went, oh no, what do we do now? There is no waterway. None of us know how to climb mountains. We weren't prepared for this. And Bolsinger says that's a great analogy of understanding where the church is today. The church was accustomed to Christendom. You're born in a Christian country. Everybody's in a parish. The working assumptions are you're American, you're a Christian. There may be a time where you sow your wild oats, you leave the church, but you're probably going to get married, have kids, and then once you get married and have kids, then you're probably going to go back to church because you're going to want to bring them to Sunday school and raise them up. Now, Sunday school is actually a little bit more recent phenomenon, but that's what we were accustomed to at the end of what we would call Christendom. And now we're not in there anymore. And this is our Rocky Mountain moment. Okay, we weren't trained for this. We don't know how to navigate this unchurched post-Christian, which is a new phenomenon where we've been there, done that, and we don't want anything else to do with it. So his book is about that. And now, we read the book, and in particular, we're at this point focusing in on this question about how does he actually define leadership? And one of the reasons that I bring him up is because he ends up making an important contribution. He's approaching this where he's looking, and he's not just focused on the individual, the leader, but he's focused upon the leader within the community. And he's concerned about the dynamics of the entire community and the role the leader has with that community. And so he starts to sit there and he says, leadership is focused on what can be or what must be. Leadership is about an organization, not just the individual, but leadership is about you within the group, helping the entire group. We can use organization, we can use community, fulfilling its mission and realizing its reason for being. For Bolsinger, leadership is not measured by title, salary, or office space. It's a way of being in an organization, family, team, company, church, business, nation, any sort of a system that mobilizes people to tackle difficult challenges and to actually thrive. Leadership is about a family, organization, church, team, fulfilling its mission. In clarifying his definition, he points to 3 fundamental principles of leadership. Leadership is absolutely essential for the group because there needs to be this sense that there is movement going on to helping us as we live in the world. It is expressed in behaviors. The way that you live has an impact. It's about who you are in relationship. That those bonds of relationship, of trust, play a huge part of just the effectiveness of real leadership. And the third essential element is that leadership is developed. Nobody's born into it. It takes time. You grow into it. Every organization is unique. Every culture, so you come in and because you were successful someplace else doesn't mean you're going to automatically be successful here. It's going to be this working out, negotiation. So we hear this focus about the leader, but within community, not just focusing on the individual, but really thinking now together, us, and beginning to define success not as what I accomplish, but what we accomplish. And now, he was a pastor, and so there's to me there's not a surprise that this is very resonant biblically with this understanding of the way that we're called to be the church together. There's a place for each and every person, but together we represent something more, and our mission is something to live out together. Now, one of the things that happened is that I was reading all of these different books on leadership, and I'm reading them and trying to understand what the book's message is and gleaning wisdom and thoughts. And then at the same time, I'm thinking always about this relationship between leadership and humility. And I'm reading all of these books on leadership and looking for how they deal with humility. And then I'm asking this question: why do some people see it and some people don't? And one of the things that I came to is to go, I've read so many of these different books, and they have kind of different focuses. Is there any sort of just simple rubrics that I could make that would kind of just help kind of categorize these different types of books? And what I ended up doing was and I didn't actually find this anywhere, but I found it just as a helpful tool for me as I'm sitting and examining all these different leadership books, is that I noticed that some of the leadership books tended to focus more organizationally. And so here's an obvious example: reframing organizations. And so and so you're not in this. It's a book on leadership, but it's really giving you a sense of just how do I understand the organization that I'm in? What's going on, And what are aspects of healthy organizations? And this is a focus on a person leading an organization, and then they're sitting there and saying, you need to recognize that there's different dynamics going on in this organization all at the same time. And you need to try to look at all those things. So that would be something that's more organization focused. Now, at the other end is you'd have something like Allender's book, Leading with a Limp. And while he has a focus about leading organizations, what he's really focused on here is the individual leader. What's going on in them? Who are they? How does real leadership get formed in this person? And so that becomes one of my axes of saying there's books that lead more towards the focus of the organization, and then there's the books that lead more towards the focus of the individual leading. And then a different axis is that you'll have some that really focus on the task and the techniques of what to do. And so here would be another example where, this is more focusing on giving you techniques and skills to apply and to do as you are in the organization, versus the other, which tends to focus on the person leading, and in particular their character. Who are they as a leader? How do they dwell within that organization? And some of what's going on inside of them, what are some of the problems? And an example of something like that would be primal leadership, which is Goleman's work, which is about emotional intelligence and you coming to understand what's going on inside of you as you lead. Or the 21 indispensable qualities of a leader, which is all focused on the individual leading and their character. And so, what I ended up doing is I created a little grid like that. And then as I started reading my different books, I would put them into one of those 4 quadrants. And if I wanted to be a little more precise, it might be how close they are towards one side or the other. Some are far over, and some, deal with some of all of those things, but it still tends to be this way. Now, I did that, and then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about humility, and not everybody sees it. And one of the things that I noticed, and I'll give you this, is so here is an example where you have the focus is on the task of leading, the technique of leading, and the organization being led. And an example of that would be the practice of adaptive leadership by Heifetz, Grashio, and Linsky. It has 2 major sections towards helping a leader understand his or her own place and function in the system. And so there's some stuff on there about character and the person leading. But primarily, that book is about the organization being led and the task of leading over the character of the leader. You get a little bit of the sum, but it fits more in that quadrant. At the other side, you have what I've said already, primal leadership, which is focusing on the person and the individual. And then you have the example of somebody who focuses on the individual and isn't so much concerned about the character, but giving you techniques and an approach about how to be effective. And Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, easily fit within that quadrant of this rubrics. And then finally, and this I will tell you is the most rare of all the leadership books out of the ones that I read at least, which is one where you're focusing on the organization, and then at the very same time you're focusing on the person leading within that organization. Aubrey Malfer's Look Before You Lead seems to fit very well in that. He wants to give pastors the ability to understand the culture, and so there it leans towards the organization over the individual. But he wants them to also orient themselves so that they can be a non-anxious presence within that culture And so there's this great emphasis on the character and what's going on inside of you as you have the role of leading. Now, I gave that first picture, and and I listed each of those books, and I gave them a letter, and then I sat there and then I put them in their quadrant. And what I found is each one of those books, in their entire book, except the one exception of Carnegie, and then there's another exception as far as in Primal Leadership where he mentions humility, but it's a very negative understanding of humility and something leaders shouldn't have. These books don't deal with humility and leadership at all. They don't see it going together. And so you stand back and you sit there and you go, okay, whatever approach you take, you can miss the significance of humility and leadership. But then what I did is I sat there and then I looked at a number of books, like 20, where they spend considerable time talking about humility in the context of leadership, and they see that these things go together. And what you'll see here is that there becomes a cluster where when leadership books focus on the person leading, their character over the task, and they're emphasizing more the individual leader in the role of leader over the organization, this seems to be the fertile soil in which humility is seen to be valuable, significant, and important. You can find it in the others. I didn't read a book that focused on the individual leading within the organization and them recognizing humility, but I read very few that fit that. But over and over, that's the part where if you're focusing on the individual over the organization, the character of the person over the task of leading, that seems to be the most fertile soil. And I proposed a couple of ideas of why this might be the case. And I'll just share with you that reflection. Perhaps the underlying cause of why it is less common for books in these different quadrants to recognize humility and leadership is due in part to our cultural bias. For some 200 years, humility has been attacked as a monkish virtue in the academy. It's an attempt to discredit and marginalize this uniquely Christian virtue. This sustained attack for modern people created both suspicion and doubt in humility's efficacy. Remember the discussions we had? Is it low self-esteem? Maybe this is an unhealthy thing. Maybe it's some sort of, neurosis, like Freud would say, of the weakness, or Nietzsche would attack, again, the weakness of that Christian virtue where you try to make the weak strong as victims. And so there's those undercurrents of this idea of humility. Now, behind this, what it seems like is it takes a little bit of time to appreciate its value. Humility may not be obvious to go with leadership, but with focused reflection, with the virtue properly defined, it's finding its way in the discussion of leadership. Remember, we've said one of the things is that people are always feeling like they need to make an apology for including leadership, and then they want to make sure that it gets clearly defined, because when I'm talking about it, I'm meaning it's something like this, but it's not just this sense of thinking less of yourself or having no confidence in yourself. When the focus of leadership is on the individual person, humility most commonly finds its way into the discussion, especially when the recognition is that the leader is to be a servant. And one of the things that we observed is that Jim Collins, didn't like the idea of servant leadership and kind of moved away from it. But through most all of the leadership literature, you'll find that sense of servant and humility going together. Biblically, there's obvious reason to support that. And so, and from that, I'm in agreement. One of the things that we have to do is we have to get the proper definition of humility. And one of the things that I'm bringing into this discussion in particular is that I think almost all of our modern discussions about humility are functioning with a deficient biblical understanding. It complicates the issue, and in some ways it causes us to miss the main thrust of the value and the focus that we should have when pursuing the cultivation of humility. Now, I want to share with you a little story, and instead of reading a section, I want to share a story about something, and it's about, again, trying to grapple with this idea of leadership. And I shared this book last week on Becoming a Leader by Warren Bennis, and then I first read this book in a leadership class in my master's program on church leadership. And when this got assigned, my reaction to it was, I can't believe the president of our seminary was asking us to read a book by a non-Christian secular book on leadership in preparing to be leading a church. And that was my attitude at the time. But it's on the reading list, and I want to do well, and so I'm going to read this book, and I'm going to write the review. And one of the great lessons that I learned is God's truth. All truth is God's truth, and that as Christians, I think that we should read broadly. I think that we should engage with culture. I think that just because it's not a Christian who's writing, just because it's a secular person, if they have experience, if they've studied, we should give them a chance at least. And so I read this book, and what I found as I read it was a whole bunch of wonderful ideas and thoughts. I didn't agree with everything, but I rarely agree with everything when I read a book. I'm bumping up against ideas, and maybe I don't fully understand what they're thinking, and so you listen and you wrestle and you think through, and then you have discussion and you try to come to a place of understanding. But one of the things that really astounded me was a lot of the things that were being said in this book was biblical wisdom. Oh, I see that in Scripture. And part of understanding leadership is that, okay, so there's this whole vast literature of leadership, but the Bible is a wonderful resource on leadership as well. And it is a place that we should be turning to understand the way of a leader. And there are some books that will really help. A beginning book would be one by, and I'll ultimately put the bibliography up and you'll have this, but Timothy Laniak. And it is a study of the concept of shepherd through the entire Bible. And he's focusing on shepherd as leader, because the metaphor was about shepherd leadership. That God calls people to lead his people, and when he calls them, he's calling them as shepherds, whether it's Moses, or priests, or kings, or even Jesus himself, who is the good shepherd. And so wonderful study looking at this entire concept of shepherd and the lively image that it was, and just all the cultural implication of what that image carried with it, where these people were resourceful, courageous, they were willing to put their lives on the line, they had to be able to be decisive, they had to be able to take care of themselves. All of these features that just went into the imagery of when you hear shepherd, this is what you're thinking. And then the implication of that about the biblical idea about God expecting those that he calls into leadership to be courageous and resourceful and to be willing to stand up and to defend. So wonderful study. I also mentioned another last week, which again, this one is using Scripture, as the raw materials of really reflecting on the Scriptures to think about leadership. And so, this becomes an aid for us to think and to listen and to realize, I never really even read the story that way, or I've never even thought about coming to the Bible and going, what leadership lessons could I learn from the life of Moses? And just so you know, Allender does that. Now, this isn't Scripture, but here's a mature Christian reflecting on the Scriptures. So I want to encourage you, as you think about leadership, as you develop your own ideas. Remember, defining leadership is a little bit challenging. It's this big, wide concept. Probably every one of us needs to come and form some sort of a working definition of leadership. But if we're going to do that, we probably got to wrestle through of why do I think these are the essential things that make up leadership? And very obviously, we're going to, as Christians, we're going to be leaning into this of saying, what do we think is the biblical model? What do we think is God's Word has to say about this? Another example of a wonderful book that leans into the issue of leadership, but really then begins to think biblically about the concept, is Bill Robinson's Incarnate Leadership. And but instead of giving you a bunch of book reviews, I'm just going to suggest those are 3 excellent books: Leading with a Limp, The Incarnate Leader, or Incarnate Leadership. I'll ultimately put this up for you, so if you're interested. And then Timothy Laniak's work on Shepherds After My Own Heart: Pastoral Traditions and Leadership in the Bible. Now, that one is a little bit more technical. He's a biblical scholar. You might not find it quite as engaging as something like Allender or even Robinson, who is writing for a more general audience and mixes in some great stories and illustrations. But it is filled with a lot of great content of Scripture, word studies, thinking through the biblical idea of the shepherd leader. Now, all of these things about how do we come to understand leadership, how do we define it, it's not going to be easy. The Bible's a great resource. All truth is God's truth. There's some great leadership literature out there. We as Christians should not just be stuck reading Christian authors. We should look to read the very best perspectives and wisdom and experience, and so we should be reading broadly. My focus has been on this area that's focusing more on the person leading, the character of the person leading, and the individual in the process of what's going on in them. Now there's a place of, again, the organization where you're called. And so where I want to take the discussion next is to say, while we could get 100 different definitions of leadership, which many of them will be similar in some ways, and people will have different lists of what their top 3 or 5 elements of a leader are, one observation I can make is that I can't even think of an example where when you get into the discussion of leadership, character isn't recognized as being something of great significance, that the character of the leader, who they are as the person in the system, is absolutely essential for good leadership. And here's I think just a great observation. Men of genius are admired, men of wealth are envied, men of power are feared, but only men of character are trusted. And one of the things about leadership is about winning trust. And this is where this character issue comes in. Another comment in this direction, this is Kouzes and Posner. Managers get people to do, but leaders get other people to want to do. Leaders do this by being credible. This is the foundation of all leadership. And that sort of perspective you will find over and over and over. Character is absolutely important, which is one of the reasons why I make the argument humility is so important to leadership and why they really do go together. A few thoughts about this. This one from Warren Bennis. Leadership courses can only teach skills. They can't teach character or vision. And he says, indeed, they don't even try. Developing character and vision is the way that leaders invent themselves to be leaders. And so there's this great focus. If you're going to lead, if you feel called to lead, then character is going to become just a huge part of what it means for you. Bennis would argue vision is another important part, which I think is pretty self-evident as well. I mean, one of the ideas of leadership is the sense of saying, I want to invite people to follow with me to get someplace, because I think it's a place that we need to go. Bennis's main discussion of the character of a leader is in a chapter called Getting People on Your Side. And this is the part where Bennis is more secular, and there's certain attitudes and values and virtues that he has that, that create a little bit of a tension, but tension's okay, and there's points of disagreement, and then there's that part where we look at it and we go, well, I'm a Christian and he's a non-Christian, and his approach is a little utilitarian. How do I get people to do what I want them to do? And I think he expects that it's going to be something good for you, but also good for them. And again, there's this practical approach. Just the skill of being able to influence people, and you're going to influence them best because, well, out of who you are, your character. And so he sits there, and as he talks about this, he says there are 4 ingredients leaders need in order to engender trust. Constancy. Leaders stay the course. They keep pushing in the same direction. Congruity. Leaders walk their talk. Reliability. Leaders are there when it counts. And integrity. Leaders honor their commitments and promises. And these are the sorts of things that you find as far as we're going to talk about character, we're going to talk about integrity, we're going to talk about trust. A different take on this is Max Dupree. And what's interesting about Max Dupree, his was The Art of Leadership, is that he doesn't really spend time talking about the significance of character, except where you find it's almost like it's just this unstated assumption in his book, is that everywhere the character of the leader is presumed that this person is selfless, humble, serving, not prideful. Listen to some of his thoughts. Leaders don't inflict pain, they bear pain. The leader is a debtor, one who owes others, is called to others, and must serve others. Leaders must give to those who follow them space to become what they can be, opportunity to serve others, the gift of challenge so that growth can occur, and the gift of meaning. The leader is a listener, open to the ideas, needs, aspirations, and wishes of those who follow. Underlying this is the self-confidence to not always be the expert. And And you'll hear resonances, especially among Christian authors, of these sorts of characteristics coming out. I want to spend a little bit of time with Allender and with Robinson, and I want to spend a little bit of time because I think they say some important things about the character of a leader. They're biblical in nature, and this may just excite you a little bit to maybe pick up one of these books and to read them and to wrestle through what they have to say. Allender writes, "Here is God's leadership model. He chooses fools to live foolishly in order to reveal the economy of heaven, which reverses and inverts the wisdom of this world. He calls us to brokenness, not performance, to relationship, not commotion, to grace and not to success." I fear, this is now Robinson, who is the incarnate leadership, Bill Robinson. I fear that those of us who lead Christian organizations have drawn more from the texts of Harvard Business Review than from the leadership texts of the Christian life. And so with Allender, so they're both approaching this from the same sort of a perspective that while there's a lot of wisdom out in the world, while there's a lot of good things to read from the Harvard Business Review on the nature of leadership, when it comes down to a Christian understanding of leadership, Jesus needs to be at the center. The Bible needs to be formative, especially when it's around the idea of character. And then when we start to wade into these issues and we have discussions about winning and success, there's a world's definition of winning and success. And then there's a biblical definition of winning and success. And the ways of both what it is and how to get there are often markedly different. So Allender approaches leadership through human brokenness and God's grace. He argues that biblical leaders are formed in the interplay between their acknowledged brokenness and God's gracious intervention. God calls us, Allender explains, to be a living portrayal of the very gospel we beseech others to believe, and that requires a leader to see himself as being as equally prone to deceive as he is to telling the truth. Now listen to this. It requires a leader to see himself as being equally prone to deceive as to telling the truth, to manipulate as to bless, to cower as he is to be bold. And what he's inviting us into is a realistic biblical anthropology, a realistic understanding of what the Bible says we are as humans. You and I are broken. At some point, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not Jesus. I can't save. I'm flawed. I have my weaknesses. And to realize that that's at work within me. And not to present myself as a false self, that I've got my entire act together, that I just have all the answers, that I need nobody else, that I'm somebody like Ayn Rand who's, figures in her stories of these great people, who overcome all obstacles and stand heads and shoulders and they're leaders because of just, their absolute separateness from all of what's common to the common man. No, we're all common. We're all of the dust. And yet, we're created in the image of God. So we've got to hold that tension. And Allender is making that argument. Don't become enamored by the world's definitions of leadership that cause your pride to be elevated to the point where you stop allowing truth to be spoken into your life. Where you refuse to look at the fact that you're flawed and you make mistakes. Not with the sense, this is the biblical idea, not with the sense that, oh, what a miserable sinner that I am. Now, it's miserable to be in sin. My primary identity is I'm beloved. But I know I haven't earned love. It's about the grace of God. That's Allender's point. And so he's holding these things in tension. A leader is both a hero and a fool, a saint and a felon. Allender would agree that leadership calls for courage, but he would also admit that there is much cowardice inside of us. According to Allender, the symptom of cowardice is our desire for control. And realize that a lot of the weaknesses and flaws of leaders come directly out of not just simply the brokenness, but the ways in which we try to cover, hide, and deny the brokenness that is within us. The path through cowardice to courage is through brokenness and humility. And you see, now we're leaning into this, and we're listening to this, to the significance of character. And then here comes the observation of one of the great gifts that humility brings. Humility allows us to see ourselves for who we are. It allows us to say, really, I just want to be a servant because I just want to be like Jesus. Now, Allender makes this argument, and I think it's a valid argument to make because it's, again, going to the biblical anthropology. No one is humble by nature because we're broken. It's the fall. And part of that brokenness is that stubborn rebellion that says, I want to be God. I don't want to be underneath God. In fact, the person who appears naturally humble is usually too lazy to be ambitious or too fearful to take risks. And one of the things he says is that leaders need to be ambitious and take risks, but it needs to be held in tension with the humility and brokenness and the grace of God, which covers that. Humility, now there's an interesting thing with Allender, and I want you to hear this, and I'm not the only one who would interact with him on this. Humility comes from humiliation, not from the choice to be self-effacing or a strong urge to give others credit. Now, one of the things going on in this definition by Allender is that he's not functioning, I think, with a great New Testament understanding of the Tapenos word group. He's functioning off the more popular idea of humility means not thinking too much of yourself. And he's sitting there and he's saying true humility does not come from people who just sit there and go, oh, I'm not really that special. True humility, he's saying, comes through the experience of being brought low, humiliation. Now, I've made the distinction of saying I don't think humility and humiliation are the same thing. But I've also argued, and I would agree with Allender in this, is that if you get called to be a leader, there's going to be times where in the call of being a leader, you're going to be humbled through humiliations. And if you go the way of Jesus, you won't respond kind for kind. And while you may be humiliated, humility can be formed in you. And humiliation doesn't automatically lead to the biblical idea of humility, but experientially there will be opportunities that we all have where we in some way experience humiliations. And then in the midst of that experience, we have a choice to make. Am I going to go the way of Jesus, or am I going to go the way of attack? Am I going to make sure that that never happens to me again? He goes on. Humility that has not come from suffering due to one's own arrogance is either a pragmatic strategy to get along with others or a natural predilection that seems to befit only a few rare individuals. Again, humility is something experientially for him, but he's again focusing mostly on how you think about yourself and how do you get to that place where you have a healthy self-estimate. And so I think that he's giving us good truth here, but I'm not completely in agreement with his definition of humility. But I also don't disagree with what happens through the experience of these humiliations. But I do agree with this. We achieve brokenness, and maybe a better way to say this is we come to the reality of our brokenness by falling off our thrones. where when we come to the end of ourselves and realize that we can't sustain, that I've been sitting up here being in charge and things are falling apart, that's typically one of those places almost all of us have to get to, that we can respond to God appropriately as God, instead of just trying to manipulate the situation to get our own advantage. And what I mean by that is, I think I was saved because I don't think salvation is about me understanding everything. I confessed that Jesus was Lord. I believed that God had raised him from the dead. But very early on in my salvation, it was much more about fitting Jesus in a small part of my life so that I had heaven taken care of, so that when I died, I went to heaven. Then it was about having God be my God and him being the leader of my life. And while I think I was saved, much of what I was doing was an attempt for me to try to control and manipulate the situation to get what I want. Now, God knows the way he made us, and he works through those desires and those passions. But at some point, we've got to grow up, and we've got to leave those childish things behind. And we've got to fall off that throne of thinking it's really about me being in charge. For Allender, we cannot choose to be broken. It only comes through the grace of being knocked off our throne. He does give this encouragement, though. To experience brokenness as well as humiliation, all you have to do is lead. Courage, tempered by humility, becomes confidence without arrogance. We're called to be courageous. We're called not to fear the things the world fears. We're called to focus our attention on Jesus. He's calling us to be in a world like sheep among wolves, that we help draw this world out of a kingdom of darkness that's in rebellion against God, that uses evil, coercion, death, hatred, destruction as its means and its weapons, to go into that battle and to stand up for truth and to refuse to retaliate. It takes courage to lean into that. And the way forward for you to have courage without arrogance is with humility. I think that's a great observation. There's a pattern for Allender that he constructs, a path of a limping leader. Our brokenness, God's gracious intervention, and the refining characteristics. And so you work through and you sit there and you go, okay, there's going to be brokenness, there's going to be intervention, and through that interplay, God is going to refine character. I'll skip forward and I'll talk about Robinson now. For Robinson, a Christian leader should be like Jesus, which for Robinson means humility. It is demonstrated when leaders resist being placed on a pedestal, choosing instead to stay close to those you lead. Christ-like leadership also means loving those you lead. Leaders will be transparent and open, which calls for integrity. Robinson returns to the idea of humility when he describes Christ-like leadership as the commitment of reflecting glory back to God. Humility's ally in reflecting glory is holding to truth and submitting ourselves to mission. We're supposed to reflect glory, and humility will reflect glory as we hold on to the truth about ourselves and we commit to being on mission for Jesus. And I think in the dynamics of that, there's some similarities there with Allender, whereas as you move forward courageously into action, there's going to be the opportunity and experiences where the light of Christ is going to shine. And yet at the very same time, you're going to realize that it's really the light of Christ and not just you, but you had some part to play. And again, in this is mostly humility, not as my working definition of a readiness to put yourself in a position to serve and use your resources to lift up others in love, but how you think about yourself. But it moves in that direction because this is all about the practical side of, well, you're not thinking of yourself so highly, so automatically you're more willing to put yourself in the situation to be on mission for Christ and to make a difference in this world. Christian leaders, according to Robinson, will exemplify grace and truth, erring, of course, on the side of grace. Now, you never let go of truth. This is the tension part. Now, his reflections are primarily out of the Gospel of John, and here I am in absolute agreement with him as he's looking at the life of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. That one of the truths that you find is that we beheld his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And one of my own convictions, and something I'd invite you, if you've never done this before, the next time you read the Gospel of John, have your focus be on paying attention to Jesus and looking in how every encounter he has, the way that he navigates with grace and with truth. And you will see that in every situation he speaks truth and he gives grace. And sometimes there's stronger sides on truth, and other times, it's almost all about just that warm embrace of acceptance. And all through you'll see that tension. And Allender says leaders who want to lead like Jesus are going to live into that tension. And if you have to make a decision about erring on truth or grace, err on the side of grace. You won't let go of the truth. But one of the questions, and I had this experience this week, I could have spoken the truth a little more bluntly to somebody, but I didn't think the relationship was ready for it, and I wasn't sure that they were ready for it. And so I held back. And I haven't let go of it. The person was speaking in a way, that was really harsh. And so you want to be heard, but it's like, wow, almost nobody's going to be able to hear that because, it's just so much of an attack. And as soon as you move to attack, and so there's truth that I want to speak into the situation, but it's like, we'll get there. But I think the person needs to know that they're appreciated and what they had to say was valuable and important. And let's get a little bit more relational time. And so in it, I erred on the side of grace over the truth at that moment. But I'm not going to let go of it because I love the person. And there's truth to be said. That's the picture that Robinson is giving. In examining the character of Jesus Christ, Robinson is inspired to this conclusion. I will try to lead in a way that reflects the miracle of God's incarnation and the glory of the incarnate Christ. Remember what I've been saying about Christians and leadership. I think all of us as Christians are called in some way to lead. Christ wants us to be his light. He wants us to influence the world. He wants us to shine so that other people can see. And we're to help them. And you start getting to that definition of a leadership as somebody who has vision and character. And that character is expressed in this commitment of love and courage and humility to serve and to help. But then there needs to be the vision of where. Well, every Christian, we're given that. We're called to go out, to proclaim the gospel, to shine as light. If we need to use words, but to exhibit the life of Christ in the way that we live. And so you are called to lead in some way. And if you're called to lead, you're called to lead in the way of Christ. And so may it be true for you and may it be true for me that the miracle of the incarnation, God with us, and the miracle of the incarnation that we see in Christ, it's ours. He's at work right now, his Spirit in you, in me. Everyone agrees that character is essential to leadership. Even when the focus is not on character, it is implied and is necessary for all the work that is offered in these leadership books to actually take place. While experts may differ on the traits that they emphasize, there is a large cluster of traits that repeatedly appear. Traits like integrity, courage, reliability, honesty, confidence, and selflessness repeat in various forms across the leadership literature. Humility appears often very closely tied to selflessness and service in some of the lists, with greater consistency among Christians writing on leadership. For Christians, Robinson's conclusion provides a solid foundation. We should seek to reflect the character of Christ revealed in the miracle of God's incarnation, and we should hold up the glory of the incarnate Christ so that people don't just see us and don't admire us, but in the end they admire the one that we admire, the one who's inspired us and given us the focus, direction, call, and is the leader of our life. So, didn't quite mean to get quite so sermonic at the end, but we've had an hour of this. Next week, when we come back, we're now at the place where we focused on these perspectives on leadership and understanding the definition and the significance of character. And now we're going to turn and we're going to focus on humility. And I actually have more content here than what I did on the leadership. It's going to take us a few weeks, but I'm going to give you a history of the virtue of humility. I'm going to offer up some of the very best insights from 2,000 years of Christian tradition on what we've learned over the centuries about the nature of humility and even how it might be formed in us. And then ultimately we'll come full circle back to looking at how the leadership literature deals with humility. And so with that, have a wonderful night and God bless. Thank you.